Hello, welcome to the University of Durham Virtual Open Day. My name's Justin Willis and I teach in the Department of History. I'm going to show you an extract from a lecture that I give to first year students. It's from a module about one of the most fundamental questions of history. How is it that some people acquire the ability to compel other people to do things that they want them to do? Power is everywhere in human societies. It's in our relationship with the state, it's in our relationship with one another. But how does it change over time? What is its basis? What makes it possible? That's what the module asks, and it looks at Africa over the last 200 years. The particular lecture I'm going to show you deals with the nature of violence, and particularly violence in the colonial state, and it concentrates on giving a summary of events in colonial Kenya. This is a lecture about colonialism and violence, and the linkage between them. Some of you will probably have heard the word Mau Mau, and you may be able to associate it with Kenya in the 1950s. Those of you who want to pursue this more can certainly look at this and other videos on the British Pathé website, which are colonial newsreels of the time. They give a very particular and slanted colonial version of this, but they give you also quite a nice sense, at least from one perspective, of what was going on. Now, if you look at those newsreels, or you look at the coverage in the British press at the time, like this clipping from the Times, you see this very much as a story of violence against white settlers, and also to some extent violence against colonial chiefs. But in the 1950s, during the period of violence, which we tend to call Mau Mau, the many thousands of people killed included only a handful of white settlers and a relatively small number of colonial chiefs. Most of those killed were ordinary people, and very many of them were killed not by insurgents, but by the police, by the army, or by the home guards working for colonial chiefs. Hundreds were hanged after brief trials. So this was a period of very intense violence, much of it within African society, as well as being aimed against the colonial state. And it raises some important questions about the linkages between colonialism and violence and power. So I want to talk very briefly today about why this happened, and I want to suggest to you that if we look for the causes of the violence of the early 1950s in Kenya, we can see it partly as growing out of circumstances characteristic of many colonial states, but also growing out of circumstances that were quite specific to Kenya as a settler colony. Kenya, like most colonial states, did not exist before colonial partition. The territory that became British East Africa in 1895 and was renamed as Kenya Colony in 1920 had no single political authority before the period of colonial rule. Lots of people lived there, but they lived in communities which had multiple forms of authority and were all relatively small scale. There was no state, there were no defined borders. In this sort of context, colonial conquest is perhaps a little bit of a misnomer. There's no great battle of conquest. There wasn't one moment in which everybody in what became Kenya realised that they were suddenly colonial subjects. This was a creeping process of changing relationships of power within many local communities, as slowly people discovered that they would be subject to the orders and commands of a new source of authority, the colonial state. Now that was itself quite often a violent process. As the demands of newly arrived colonial officials increased, for tax or for labour or to obey laws that they were imposing, at some point there usually came a stage where people said no. For one reason or another, they decided that they didn't want to follow those orders, and that very often led to violence. Generally, this was small scale, brutal, lethal violence, but relatively small scale. Colonial conquest was made possible by new technologies in weapons, in communication and transport that allowed colonial forces to be concentrated and to deploy lethal force against relatively small communities in these many little moments of colonial conquest. This is a map taken from an article which looks at the process of conquest in Western Kenya. Each of the triangles on it is what the British call a punitive mission, a raid launched against a society which had refused to obey colonial orders. As you'll see, there are quite a lot of those triangles. Each one represents a moment of violence. Sometimes, as I say, really quite small scale, sometimes larger, but all usually involving no more at the most than hundreds of people. Now, while colonial forces had superiority in terms of technology, as I've suggested, they were numerically very few. This is a photograph of Machakos Fort at the end of the 1890s. From this little fort, with that handful of soldiers and police that you can see, an area of hundreds and hundreds of square miles was nominally being ruled. This was obviously a challenge for the colonial state. How would it be possible to exert authority over such a large area with so few people? And especially when people refused to obey colonial demands, what would happen? How could this small group of people enforce those demands? Well, the answer was that they found allies, usually within local society, usually people of influence, who for one reason or another were willing to make deals with this potent new source of power because they thought it would be useful to them in their own search for wealth or status. So, for example, the man pictured here in the centre of the photograph, Lenana, a Libon or prophet of the Maasai people, saw in the British a possibility to extend his own status and power, but also to allow his followers to recover from a devastating period of animal sickness which had reduced their herds and their wealth very significantly in the 1880s and 1890s. So Maasai young men were willing allies of the British in a number of their punitive missions in the early years of colonial rule. They helped make colonial rule possible. They were not the only people from African societies to be so involved. Now, over time, the British recruited more soldiers and police locally, like the men of the King's African Rifles, seen here in 1902. They put them into uniforms, they gave them weapons, they turned them into a disciplined force. That meant that they had more coercive power of their own, and they needed less to rely on allies like Lenana. And so over time, such allies were dispensed with, often in rather brutal ways. Lenana, for example, found that he and his people lost access to grazing land, which they thought the British had guaranteed them in their role as allies. When they were no longer needed as allies, that land was given to white settlers. Now, over the first 2 to 3 decades of colonial rule, the number and extent of punitive missions slowly declined. They didn't vanish entirely, but they became fewer, quite simply because people had learned that it was lethally dangerous to risk challenging colonial orders too openly. What happened over this time is that violence became, as we say, increasingly euphemized. Colonial states, Kenya included, loved parades. They loved uniforms. There were constant events of flag lowering and flag raising, the arrival and departure of officials. All of these involved parades and uniforms and guns in very ostentatious ways. They were a constant reminder to people of the dangers of resisting the colonial state. Colonial states loved uniforms so much that even as they extended the range of their activities, for example establishing medical departments, they put the staff of those medical departments into uniforms which looked very much like those of colonial police or soldiers, as with this picture on the right-hand side, showing a medical department orderly in the 1940s. Now, what all this meant, this euphemization of violence, was that violence was cheaper. It didn't vanish, it was always in the back of people's minds. But because there was less need for constant punitive missions, it was actually cheaper to rule the colony, cheaper to get things done. But there was an aspect to this which had a long-term and insidious effect. Holders of power in the colonial state always assumed, fundamentally, that their power rested on their ability to do violence. And while in theory colonial states were based on law and order, and prided themselves on their introduction of a regime of law, behind that law always lay the possibility of violence, and sometimes a violence which would explode well beyond the theoretical boundaries of the law. This is what some people have called incumbent violence, the kind of habit of violence that spread through colonial states that was so reliant on force as the basis of authority. Now, even with the euphemisation of violence, colonial states still needed local agents, and this is where the chiefs and the headmen came in. In some ways, one might see these as successors to men like Lenana, but they were now more like agents than allies of the colonial state. These were men, almost always, who possessed some kind of local influence or status, but who at the same time were taken into the colonial state as its lowest rung and used to enforce the law and order of the colonial state. As you'll see from the picture of these two men here, who were chiefs in the 1920s, the way they dressed, the material culture with which they surrounded themselves, reminded people of their links to the colonial state. In this case, they each have a staff of office given to them by colonial officials. One of them is wearing, very obviously, a military uniform, which suggests he'd been in the colonial army. Over time, the uniforms changed a little. This chief from the 1940s, as you see, prefers to wear a suit and tie, and to signify his military links to wearing of medals instead. But always, somewhere in the background, people knew that chiefs were linked to the violence of the colonial state. So these were agents of the state, but they also, of course, were people with their own agendas, their own interest in building up their wealth and status locally, in local society. Colonial chiefs were supposed to enforce the law. They were also supposed in some way to follow customary law, to preserve, to keep order through observing what was assumed to be a customary law. They were linked to a court system which was supposed to be, partly at least, around customary law. Colonial chiefs recruited their own police, sometimes on a very ad hoc basis, as you can see here with this picture of Chief Jacob from Western Kenya and his police in the 1930s. These were their enforcers, their retainers. They were a sort of version of the colonial state's own police and soldiers, but a very rough and ready one. Now, there's quite a division in the literature on how we see colonial chiefs. Some historians see them, at least to some degree, as figures whose influence, whose authority relied somewhat on ideas of custom, on local consent. Others see them much more as simple petty despots, reliant on force, backed up by the colonial state, always willing to do the bidding of the colonial state, and always with an eye on improving their own wealth and improving their own status as they did so. So the extent to which any of these colonial chiefs really were customary varied, and is certainly a matter for some debate, and we'll look at some of the literature about this over the course of discussion about the colonial state. But colonial chiefs were central to the way that the state worked. The state relied on them, it backed them up with force, and it assumed that they would get things done, and colonial officials often turned a blind eye to misbehaviour by chiefs. Now, those things were common enough in colonial states across Africa. Most colonial states had chiefs, or headmen as they were sometimes called. Most relied on them, and most backed them up with force. But Kenya was different in one way to many colonial states, in that it also had white settlers. The white settlers were brought to Kenya because the colonial state believed that the effective economic exploitation of the territory relied on white entrepreneurs like these. But those settlers were not themselves able to farm. They had to have the land and the labour of Africans to do this. And so the colonial state found itself effectively supporting these settlers, using force to make sure that they had land, and then using force to police a very punitive system of labour regulation, which was intended to make sure that Africans worked for them. This, of course, created multiple tensions between settlers and Africans, between the state and Africans. It also created tensions within African society, because the loss of land and the enforcement of labour regulations affected people differently, and it affected the way chiefs dealt with their people, because chiefs, of course, were involved in enforcing colonial laws. Now, this all meant that the situation in Kenya was distinctive in the 1940s and 1950s. Across the continent, what was happening in that period was that colonial advantages that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, in terms of weaponry, in terms of communication and transport technologies, had been eroded by the passage of time. Africans were beginning to mobilise on a new scale against the colonial state. Almost everywhere, initial mobilisations were met with violence. Protesters were beaten, leaders were arrested. But quite quickly, imperial governments in France, Britain and elsewhere realised that the cost of such violence, when it could no longer simply be euphemised, were too high to bear, and so they turned to negotiation, which led, of course, to the end of colonial rule across much of Africa by the early 1960s. But in Kenya, settlers were determined to maintain their privilege, and were determined, therefore, that the state should be willing to bear the cost of violence against African political mobilisation. That was why the situation in Kenya became so violent in the early 1950s. And once that happened, violence spilled out in unpredictable ways along the many fault lines that had developed in colonial Kenya, between settlers and African population, between the colonial state and an African population, but also within African society, chiefs against people, wealthy against poor. That was why there was so much violence, and that was why so much of it occurred within African societies, not simply between the state and Africans. Now there's a twist in the tale to this story. The very cost of suppressing the Mau Mau insurgency, and in military terms it had been largely contained by 1956, made the imperial government think again. While the settlers wanted them to bear this cost, the British government were not willing to do so. They could not afford to sustain the presence of thousands and thousands of soldiers in Kenya in the long term. So they did indeed turn to negotiation, and that led to Kenya's independence in 1963. But the Kenya that became independent had been shaped by colonial rule. Those who took power, those who assumed the offices of government, had been shaped by their experience of this intrusive, violent state with its fascination with uniforms and its willingness to use violence against its people. The very picture of the independence ceremony shown here, with the new leader of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, being sworn in, reminds us of the continued prominence of military uniforms in the rituals of the state. Kenya, like many African states, was to be shaped by its colonial legacy and by the particular linkages between violence and power that had been created by colonialism.